Welcome to the program. Joining us today is a familiar face. He is a gentleman who served as state representative in the 7th Plymouth District, also ran for U.S. Senate. He is a Republican candidate for governor. We have Mr. Geoff Diehl joining us. Geoff, welcome to the program.
Kevin, great to see you. Thank you very much for having me here.
If you will, right out of the gate, talk to us about your time as a state rep, serving East Bridgewater, Abington, and Whitman.
That's right. Well, first of all, Kevin, thanks for always having me on when I was serving as a state representative. That was from 2011 till 2019, and it was 8 great years of representing 3 great towns. In fact, we're in Abington right now. We're taping at the high school, the new high school that I was involved with the approval of. So really a great chance to see a facility that was, part of serving the community. But I'll tell you, it was an honor to serve in the legislature and work on big issues that faced Massachusetts, from the foreclosure crisis, the opioid crisis, and a lot of great things too, trying to make sure that we're getting small businesses the resources they need, helping fishermen do a better job of being able to be competitive in the region. So there was so many things that probably too much to tell right now, but serving as in the legislature for the 7th Plymouth District was an honor, and you having me on so many times to talk about what was going on, I really appreciated that.
What have you been doing since serving as state rep? And if you will, share with us what was the conversation that planted the seed for you to become a candidate for governor?
Well, nobody just decides to run for governor out of the blue, and since 2018, when my term expired at the end of 18, and by the way, I ran for U.S. Senate against Elizabeth Warren in that 2018 cycle. Since that election was over, I've worked in the private sector, both with my wife's business, helping her with some certain things, and then working in the healthcare industry, and now I'm working for a company out of northern Massachusetts that deals with auto parts. So it's great to be back in the private sector, a place that I was very familiar with, because before I ran for office, I was 40 years old. I was working for a small business, and my wife and I had a small business as well, which is a performing arts school. So the reason I mention that too is because during the pandemic, which just hit in this last year and a half, one of the things that happened to all small businesses, they were shut down. And with the Performing Arts School, my wife was able to adapt immediately. A week later, she was reopened, doing classes online, Zoom classes. And that's not easy, doing dance, acting, and voice, but at least it gave kids a chance to get online, continue to do what they were doing as far as education in performing arts. And we were able to finish out the year. And the next year was really interesting because there was obviously the cohorts for public school. Some kids would go into school 2 days a week, and then the other kids would be at home, and then they'd flip. So really, kids were still at home for about 3 days a week, and a lot of parents were finally able to go back to work, or their companies brought people back. And a lot of those parents had a tough time trying to figure out how their kids could be monitored doing their online classes while they were at work. So we opened we used the Performing Arts School to open a learning pod, and we let kids come in and we set up computers to allow them to access their classes. And then we helped guide them, because we had all age groups from elementary through high school. We helped guide them to the platforms they needed, to the content they needed. So that was a challenge. But again, to sum it all up, I've been working in the private sector, and of course with the pandemic, trying to help out where I can. Now, running for governor, the discussion has been, how can I take a lot of what I learned in the time I was serving in the legislature, marry that up with what I know from the private sector, and see if we can do a better job going forward, more prepared for things like the pandemic. But on top of that, make sure we deliver what we're supposed to deliver for state government. The MBTA, transportation, is still an issue. I know that education had a real tough time with the pandemic. Let's look at some of the positives from the pandemic, like remote learning, and see if we can offer classrooms to kids where districts really can't afford an extra teacher for, let's say, a foreign language. Maybe we can take some of what we learned there. So for me, it's a chance to take what I learned, like I said, from the state legislature, but also when I ran for U.S. Senate, I got to travel all around Massachusetts and really learn about every region, what's critical for them. For example, in Western Massachusetts, internet access. A lot of people take it for granted here on the east coast of Massachusetts. Out in Western Massachusetts, it's a big issue. It affects business, it affects education. So I think we can do some things there as well. But I certainly have a lot of time to, now that we're starting this campaign, to talk about those issues, and I'm looking forward to a healthy, robust debate within the Republican primary side, if there is a Republican primary, and then in the general election as well.
It's worth noting, and you referenced it, you are not new to campaigning around the state. It's vastly different than within your own community or within your district where you're serving some 40,000 people. You're going around the Commonwealth, 351 communities, and talking about why folks should vote for you or why they should be invested in what you're talking about. And while you did not get the success that you wanted as a candidate for U.S. Senate, you were successful when it came to the ballot question that had to do with indexing a gas tax. And so if anybody knows how to work around the Commonwealth, it's yourself. And I might add is that campaign was an award-winning campaign.
It was. Yeah, I never knew there was an award for political campaigns, but that we did win that. I will say though, Kevin, just one quick caveat is that I was the third highest vote getter in 2018. After the governor and after my opponent in the U.S. Senate race, I was the third highest person who achieved the votes in the state back then. So truthfully, I think there's a lot of people out there who did support me. The fact was that in that race for U.S. Senate, I think that they were looking for someone who was a bit more pointed about national issues, and for me, my focus has always been on what's good for Massachusetts, which is why in 2014 I led that repeal of indexing the gas tax to go up automatically every year without a vote. I thought that was the wrong thing to do. In 2013, then Governor Deval Patrick had put two taxes on the table. One was this tech tax and one was the index gas tax. And the technology sector pushed back so hard that within 2 weeks, the Democratic majority in the House and Senate repealed it. You know, the Republicans had been saying, look, don't pass this tech tax because all those businesses basically can pull their internet cord and their power cord and move to another state overnight. And sure enough, that's exactly what they threatened, so that's why it was repealed. But the gas tax was a much more in-depth education process for people around the state because they just figured that, you know, it was a gas tax that hadn't been updated for a while. They didn't realize that it was going to go up every year automatically forever, and not a single representative in the House or Senate was going to have to vote for it, which is the only tax in the state, had it been able to stand, that would have done that. So we also had to argue the merits, of course, of the gas tax and the fact that we really actually had plenty of money in the state. We were spending wildly over what most states spend for road maintenance and construction. On top of which the impact of the gas tax itself has on middle to low income families. It's a regressive tax, everybody knows that, because it doesn't just affect what you pump into your car, which is tough for people commuting to work and taking your kids to activities, but also all the goods that you purchase. Everything that you buy has to be transported by the last mile, usually by truck or something like that, and that usually means that that cost increase gets passed on to the consumer. And finally, every municipality is not exempt from the gas tax, so every police car, every fire truck, ambulance, school bus, all the gas being used in every one of those municipalities would have an increase in cost, which gets passed through to you through your property tax. So we said that, look, the overall impact of raising this gas tax every year automatically means there's no accountability on Beacon Hill. We pushed the issue in 2014, had a campaign to go out there and do it, and I spent pretty much every weekend and free moment I had going on radio and TV and everywhere I could be to talk to people. And we ended up winning that issue pretty overwhelmingly in November of 2014. We actually outperformed Governor Baker when he ran for election that year, when he was elected the first time. We exceeded his vote total by about 50,000 votes. So really it was an issue that affected, it wasn't a partisan issue, it was a pocketbook issue that I think a lot of people were happy that it got done. Now, ironically, we're looking at Governor Baker now, several years later, trying to impose another gas tax. It's TCI, it's the Transportation Climate Initiative. And if he decides to stay with it, I'm going to make sure that I get out there and talk to people about the downside to it all. But in a nutshell, it's another basically gas tax where, in this case, the environmental gains, the reduction in carbon emissions, Sierra Club's come out and said that really, based on what's happened with the pandemic, the remote working now, and even the fact that cars are more fuel efficient, that it really has a negligible, if any, effect on the climate, this whole goal that they're trying to do with the TCI. But it's also even more nefarious in that it's an unelected bureaucratic body that decides what the fee will be, the cap and trade fee will be on energy, in this case gas. And that means that every year they can change, and add to what our gas tax is in an effort to sort of, again, cut carbon emissions. But most of the state is already moving towards carbon emissions reduction through more fuel efficiency with cars. This state's actually signed on to making sure that no new cars after, I think, I forget what year it is, but there's basically going to be mostly electric cars on the road at some point in the next decade or two. So the fact is that this thing really is just another way to kind of dictate and make it more expensive for people who just need that gas to get around.
If I could ask you, you talk about this administration signing on to TCI, the Transportation Climate Initiative. Is Massachusetts the only state in the New England region that is in favor or supporting this this movement? Or
well, according to the governor and the people who originally designed it, it shouldn't have been. It was a whole regional New England pact, and we saw that they even added the District of Columbia to try to see if they could get support there as well. The ironic part is that the District of Columbia is the only other partner in this regional pact, and all of the New England states except Massachusetts, except Governor Baker, are the ones who have decided they want to continue forward with this. So even New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, Rhode Island just recently declined to adopt it. I mean, most of these New England states that we thought that may be going on to this thing said, no, it's not going to work for us. And I think Massachusetts has to take a real hard look at that and say, maybe we've got this wrong.
Okay. What do you feel are going to be some of the key issues in this race? First, for the Republican nomination, and if there's success there, ultimately to be the next governor of the Commonwealth?
Well, I think that clearly everybody wants to have someone who's serving as governor who has a vision of how the state can always do better. You're looking at, again, a year and a half of being shut down, and a lot of people were really questioning what was going to happen after the pandemic. Could we as a state, can we as a country come back? So they're looking for someone who's got, I think, that experience of serving in the legislature, knowing what levers can be pulled and pushed to make sure that the state does its part. And then, of course, I think having small business experience means that, I'm someone who understands what it's like to put a paycheck out there for other people, not just collect a paycheck, and make sure that you have long-term planning so that you're successful in your business. And that's not easy in a state where there's a lot of regulation and a lot of fees. But once you've weathered those storms and know what to do, I think it means that you can be a chief executive officer for the state that really has a good understanding across the board of what you have to do. So one of the things I'd say that's important in this issue, again, is getting back to things like healthcare, for example, healthcare costs. One of the things the governor promised was more transparency in procedures and medical devices. We never really saw that transpire. I think the only way to get healthcare costs down is to create free market pressure. I think what we need to do is have things like healthcare procedures put online so that somebody knows if they want to get a hip replacement in, say, Newton, it's going to cost X, and if you want to get it done in Springfield, maybe it costs Y, and you can do some research and see where you want to go for that sort of thing. So re-empower the consumer when it comes to their health care. Same thing with education. I think we tend to look at education as just an automatic, but really it's a consumer thing. And has Massachusetts, the education system, been responsive to the kids as a consumer? Or are they really looking at their own self-interest sometimes? I know private schools have to do a really good job of selling themselves, their curriculum, their teachers, to make sure a parent wants to spend the money to send a kid out of their district into a private school. It costs additional money from what you pay in taxes. I think the public school needs to look at what they're giving to kids and saying, are we giving them what they need to get into college and do what they need to do? And again, with the pandemic, we saw that maybe there's an opportunity to use remote learning to augment some of the classes they aren't currently getting in their district if they can't afford it. But at the same time, is testing, MCAS testing right now, showing exactly where we need to be with our kids? I think sometimes we over-test our kids and it doesn't give us the right focus on servicing all the kids. If you talk to teachers, they'll always say we end up teaching to the test.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah, maybe we need to look at how we're doing that. You know, there's the bubble kids, right? I was in this program where we were talked specifically about how education, a lot of these teachers, they know that the high performers are going to do well. They don't focus on them. They know the low performers may not do well, so they don't focus on them. They just look at the kids right in the middle, the ones that are on the bubble of, you know, doing well with scoring, and they focus on helping them. That doesn't service everybody. So let's maybe take a look at education and see if we're delivering it as effectively as we should. And transportation, obviously, we've got to continue to look at the MBTA. Just before the pandemic and before demand just completely went away, we still had trains that were running off the rails, literally. We had train cars that were being provided by a Chinese manufacturer that's here in the state that didn't even meet the specifications to be put on the tracks. So what are we doing with transportation as far as the money we're spending? Are we getting what we deserve? I think that's what people want. Government to be there to provide what they're supposed to, deliver. And to be honest with you, I think maybe government needs to step back out of our personal lives and just be there, to do their job that they're assigned to do. Let a lot of the pontificating and other things, sort of, the national issues, let's not focus on the negativity and the nastiness towards each other anymore. I think people would like to see a reduction in the ugliness of politics.
I think on all levels, depending on who you ask, I think a majority of the time, if you ask the regular Joe, the Jane, as to what are their concerns, I think it's taxes, containing taxes from going up, education, Chapter 70 funding, and their roads, sidewalks, to have good roads.
And then there's retirement too.
And there's retirement as well.
People want to make sure, look, right now the federal government, I hate to use the term, is printing money. They have passed some major trillion-dollar spending bills to get the U.S. economy back up and running. At some point that has to catch up with the dollar, and that means that the dollar loses its value. When the dollar loses its value, that means that there's inflation. And inflation means that what you bought yesterday costs a lot more today, including the food, again, the fuel, and housing. All of that tends to go up with inflation, obviously. And I think a lot of people who want to either retire or maybe are just starting out and looking to buy a new home and start a family have major concerns about whether or not we're putting the money in the right place when we have those federal spending dollars. So one of the big things that I think we need to do too right away is take some of that federal money that's coming in for recovery and put it towards the unemployment insurance. As everybody knows, that unemployment insurance was depleted massively because everybody basically was out of work overnight. By the way, not state employees. I will say that that's one thing that people really should question is why is it that the public sector was furloughed or laid off immediately, and even the people who, by the way, sometimes when there's a snowstorm, they're called non-essential workers. They're allowed to go home from state government. There was no non-essential workers during the pandemic, despite the fact that most offices became closed and there was no really public traffic through any buildings. So I'll leave that on the side as just a note that I think state government doesn't necessarily show the same pain as maybe the private sector does. And the private sector employs about 80% of the working folks in our state. So you have to take a look at that. But anyway, unemployment insurance, that fund has been depleted. I think some of the trillions of dollars that are being spent around the country, the millions here in Massachusetts that are coming here, should go to reinvesting in unemployment insurance so the businesses aren't hit with a huge bill to replenish that.
Prior to the pandemic, I believe that the state legislature did pass a Student Opportunity Act that was supposedly going to be the update to the Ed Reform of '93. That's supposedly going to put money back into education. We know that there's work trying to be done in regards to transportation, fixing our roads and our bridges. But where is this money coming from? How does a Diehl administration still provide funding for education, fix the roads and bridges, but not raise the taxes?
Right. It's the age-old question, right? Where do you get the money? And I think, again, with the gas tax, people said there was crumbling roads and bridges. What are we going to do? And I said, okay, we've had that argument time and time again. And what we find is that the money that's set aside to fix roads and bridges ends up getting pilfered by the legislature and used for other purposes. So first of all, you've got to stop playing the shell game of the money's going to be used for this and then it end up spent somewhere else, right? That's one thing. Secondly, I think the state can run more efficiently. I think that we can find public-private partnerships in road construction. I think we've already looked with AAA. We do a lot of co-services, meaning a lot of the stuff that was done in state offices got moved over to AAA to allow them to handle RMV functions like licensing and things like that. So those are smart moves, but we need to continue to do more of that. So yeah, no, I understand that the challenge is that, you know, theoretically you want government to provide a lot of things, but at the same time, I think the private sector can also provide a lot of things as well. So we got to make sure that we're not overstepping our bounds. I know that, for example, people think that government should just pay for college in total. There's the whole, you know, college should be free and government should pay for it. Well, first of all, Massachusetts already takes care of top 25% by giving them the Abigail Adams Scholarship, which means they go to state schools for free if their grades are high enough, right? So there's already incentive to have good grades. But secondly, if you actually make college free for kids, what you're doing is saying to colleges, there is no accountability for you in what you're going to charge for tuition. So what's going to happen is the cost of college is going to go up. It's happened in healthcare. Basically, when healthcare became a mandated, everybody had to have healthcare coverage, those insurers and hospitals, everybody, the pharmaceutical companies started raising the prices of all healthcare. Either whether the prescriptions that you have, the procedures that you get done, or your insurance, all of it ended up going up because government was the guaranteed payer. So with college education, if government becomes the guaranteed payer, tuition is going to increase. And while it's great to give everybody a college education, I think everybody should strive towards that. When you do that, that cost has to be passed on to somebody. Nothing in life is free, so that's going to be passed back on to the taxpayer. And is it fair for, you know, I think this is another big argument. Is it fair for, let's say, I think 2/3 of kids, a third of Massachusetts students, like men go into the military, or they go into a trade union. Is it fair for them to basically be paying taxes to cover the cost of college education if they never plan on doing that? So again, I think that we need to not necessarily step in and say government should solve every problem. It should just be there as a referee in some cases. And I think making sure the colleges actually drive down the cost, if we can figure out ways to do that, well, that's where I'd like to go.
When you took office in 2011, I believe the budget that was passed was $28 billion. This coming fiscal year, they're currently working on a bill that will be $46 billion. What needs to be done to reduce spending when it comes to on the state level?
So this kind of talks a little bit about what you said before. How do you get government to be able to afford things? Well, the problem is they can afford just about everything because of the tax revenue they bring in. I mean, ironically, when the pandemic was kind of as we're phasing out of it, there's a tax surplus right now. Governor Baker has actually talked about taking the additional tax revenue that was unexpected and putting it towards a 2-month sales tax holiday. Okay, so there is revenue there, and again, I think that should be going to the unemployment insurance to shore it up. But the bigger issue that you're talking about is a 70% increase in the state budget from the time I was elected to the time I'm running now for governor. In 10 years, our budget has gone up by 70%. And just, if you think about that as an individual, has your income gone up 70%? But state government's income has gone up 70%. That is incredible, an incredible number. And when I say income, I mean that's the revenue they're taking in and then what they're going to spend. So look, I know government doesn't keep all the money, but the fact of the matter is they are spending an exorbitant amount of money, and that's not even including the federal taxes that you're paying and what the federal government is spending right now. So again, I think what we're looking at for the future is an opportunity for Massachusetts to, let's just rethink how government's done. Let's re-empower the individual, and let's see if we can get government to take a little bit of a step back from where they've been for these last 10 years, and certainly the massive imposition on people over the last year and a half. And I understand it was for people's safety, what they were doing. But again, if you talk to restaurant owners, a lot of them were very upset that there was very arbitrary rules for the pandemic. I mean, if you and I are sitting down, we can take our masks off, but if we're standing up to leave, the masks have to be on. If you're a small business owner, you have to close, but if you're Walmart or Target, you get to be open. I mean, that really upset a lot of people. If you're a bar and you serve food, you're closed. But if you're a restaurant that serves alcohol, you're open. All right, so these are some of the things that I think people really question from the pandemic, and we have to make sure that we make rules that are, I think, in line with what people think.
We talk about setting policy and crafting laws. Just over the past year, a policy was put in place in regards to law enforcement. Give me your thoughts as to how law enforcement is perceived in any legislation, the legislation that was just put in for law enforcement reform.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think any police officer will admit that there's always a portion of their population, like any company or any workforce out there, there's going to be a certain percentage that may not be the best actors. In the case of law enforcement, Officer Chauvin from Minneapolis was prosecuted for what he did with George Floyd. And I think you look around the state, you see that the same thing happens. If police officers do the wrong thing, they get fired, they lose their pensions, they go to jail in some instances. So I think there's a misgiving that police officers are above the law. They're not above the law, but they are asked to execute the law. And when it comes to executing the law, they are the front line of defense when it comes to violent criminals. There was a standoff recently outside Wakefield with a militant group that had numerous guns that were unregistered. They were dressed in military fatigues and said they were off to Maine for training. And that could have been escalated to a very violent standoff, but thankfully police took all day and were able to de-escalate the situation. I don't know who else could go there and have the presence and the ability to handle a dangerous situation like that other than law enforcement. And at the same time, law enforcement has a very soft hand too in our communities, which is great. You know, the local DARE officer for the town I live in, Whitman, he goes into the middle school, talks to the high school, and makes sure that he helps kids stay active, involved, and away from things like drugs. He's a divergence officer for the bad things that happen. And, you know, to have a community be able to afford somebody like that is fantastic. And that's the problem. When you start cutting the police budget because you just feel like, you know, they're bad actors intentionally, and I totally disagree with that. I mean, in 2018, I had a debate with Senator Warren. She called law enforcement racist from front to back. I totally disagree with her on that assessment. On top of that, now we have, you know, a top law enforcement official in Massachusetts is the Attorney General Maura Healey, who may get into this governor's race. She said during the 2020 riots that sometimes you need a forest fire to, you know, regrow things. That to me seemed to be condoning a lot of the looting, the arson, and violence that was happening in every city as they were burning in 2020. That's the wrong way to go. Law enforcement's there to uphold the law. They're there to protect our communities. I support them, and I want to make sure that they have the resources they need to get the job done, and that includes the equipment they have, but more importantly, the training. So again, more funds towards training allows them to, I think, avoid the situations that happen like in Minneapolis when the officer used a procedure and a chokehold that was completely unacceptable. So good training is the way to go, and cutting their funding and basically making it impossible to effectively train police officers, wrong way to go.
Would you be supportive of police body cameras for all police departments, or funding an effort to have all police departments, officers on the street to have body cameras, so at least you'd be able to see what's happening from the point of view when it's happening?
I think that's great. In fact, if you talk to law enforcement officers, a lot of people nowadays pull their cell phones out immediately and record the situation. So, you know, I think already we're living in a world where there's sort of surveillance everywhere you go, cameras on buildings, all that. So to have the police officers have the ability to show exactly what they're facing when they have a traffic stop, for example, or are dealing with a very violent situation, I think it's important to have that side of the story told as well. Because if you ever talk to a law enforcement officer, they'll say that what they have to decide to do in a split second takes a year in court to be undone. You know, the prosecutors can look at this and the defense attorneys can look at this and go over everything they had to make a split-second decision on and second-guess them for a year in court. So look, the more they can make their case, I think the better. I think it's a good move forward.
As we get ready to wrap up our conversation here, we thank you for being here. Anything we haven't touched upon but you feel is going to essentially be a conversation during this race and during the campaign, and as you are engaging other candidates about the issues?
Well, look, I think generally speaking, most campaigns tend to be about pocketbook issues. What's, you know, going to be the financial impact for the voter? I mean, they tend to look at government is being able to provide them what they need, the roads, the bridges, the schools, and you know, I think what they're looking for is a steady hand. And I think what they need to understand is that you know, someone who, like myself, has served in the legislature, has listened to a lot of the things people need help with. Foreclosure issues. Back when I first got started and got into office, we were dealing with the 2008-2009 economic meltdown. I've dealt with foreclosure issues all the way through the opioid crisis, which, by the way, people are saying the pandemic may have actually re-exacerbated, so we need to make sure that people are getting the help they need. Right here in the South Shore, we have some fantastic communities that do a great job of interceding. So look, I think there's a lot of things that people know I've been there for in the past as a legislator, and I think serving in the corner office and having a chance to talk about what's important for Massachusetts all across the state, from our great fishing ports that are the most valuable in the country, to Western Massachusetts, which always gets underrated but has tremendous manufacturing, and Worcester, I mean Springfield, two great cities that contribute so much to our economic life in Massachusetts. We're going to need to talk about all these things. I'm looking forward to that conversation over the next year or so.
Excellent. He is Geoff Diehl. He is a candidate for governor. We thank him for stopping in, and we thank you for tuning into a program like this to keep you better informed. Until our next conversation, have a good day.